research is super interesting, and it looks at how the human mind enabled us to learn, create, and transmit culture. She looks at comparison across age, culture, and species to look at fundamental questions of cognition and culture. So she really is quite transdisciplinary. So her areas of interest and expertise include global public health, international education, child development, and cognitive science. And her research and training really reflects a commitment to building a globally representative and inclusive cognitive science disciplines. So she works with colleagues doing really incredibly interesting research all over the world. She draws on insights from cognitive, cultural, developmental, educational, and evolutionary psychology, as well as cognitive and evolutionary anthropology, to facilitate cross-fertilization within and across disciplines. She is an author on over 100 publications. She's been funded by lots of places like the NSF National Science Foundation, the McDonald Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation. And then lastly, I'll say she got a PhD from the University of Michigan. She was a new mild advisor to Fred Morrison. And she's the recipient of the 2015 APS Janet Taylor Spence Award for Transformative Early Career Contribution and APA William McCandless Award for her research on evolutionary and ontogeny of culture and cognition. Yeah. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cristine Legare. Well, what an absolute pleasure to be here. I especially appreciate the weather. Thank you for ordering that specific for me. I'm taking pictures of my feet surrounded by red leaves, and my family thinks I'm in some enchanted kingdom, which I think I very well could be. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here and to share a kind of big picture overview of a research program, transdisciplinary research program. I can label it that way because I aspire to that. That I've been working on for quite a number of years. So I want to give you a big picture perspective on what we're trying to understand about the human capacity to acquire the knowledge and skills and practices of any population that they're into. So what impresses me most about humans is the flexibility and plasticity, cognitively, culturally, that's required to adapt to so many different cultural ecologies. So I talked to colleagues of mine in psychology departments who, like, a big part of what psychologists are doing is kind of pushing aside the noise of culture to get to the essence, our essential nature. But from my perspective, culture, this is our nature. And this is like cultural diversity makes humans most interesting. It makes us most unique. So that's where all the action is, from my perspective. For a sense of how my team and I study this and what our fundamental questions are in this space. So explaining the unique features of human culture, including its complexity and its diversity, requires studying cognition, so our cognitive processes, as well as our repertoire, universal repertoire of learning strategies. Now, in culture, this allows us to acquire, to transform, and to transmit cultural information across generations. So that's kind of fundamentally what we're interested in doing. And when I say cumulative cultural learning, what I'm talking about there is the suite of cognitive and learning processes that allow us to not just learn culture, but also to transform and transcend it. Okay. So let's stop just for a second to remind everyone how different the environments that we currently are living in, how different they are from the environments that our species has lived in for the overwhelming majority of our time, long time, on this planet. Right? And this technological change is happening so quickly that I think we often don't really appreciate how different our environments are now, and also how consequential this is for understanding child development. Right? So children are learning technologies and skills and information is very different than a generation ago, right? And there's, of course, enormous global variation in this. So human technology has gone from hand axes to hardware in the span of a few thousand years. Just a blip in human history, a huge change. And the speed of technological change the pace just keeps increasing, right? Just imagining these are 100 of these events are 100 years apart, right? Do we have a sense of the implications of this for cognitive processes and the various Vanuatus? I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface. It's also a reminder that studying children that are living in these kinds of environments as though they are representative of the world and the species over the course of our history, right? The populations that dominate psychological literature are the least representative possible of the globe and of human history. So technological complexity is the result of many things, right? It's due in part to our remarkable capacity to build upon the innovations of others, right? Social learning is our superpower, right? It's a lot of the literature on innovation in humans has really emphasized our amazingly powerful and complex brains, which we have. But the truth is our brains are not that different than what they were for the majority of our time on the planet. And yet our technological complexity is wildly more, right? So how do we explain this ratcheting up of innovation in a relatively short period of time? Now, cumulative culture, it makes individuals actually more capable of innovation because it allows us to build on the insights and innovations of others. That's the social learning component. So consider things like mobile devices. Anyone here with that one right now? So these are ubiquitous in our environments. There's probably not a human alive who understands the full technological repertoire required to build a cell. There's no one on the planet who could build one from scratch. So our understanding of these technologies is really, really, really distributed. We often feel, you ask people, or do you feel like you understand how a mobile phone works? If I had to, on a scale of 1 to 10, right? How well do you feel if you understand how a mobile phone works? You'd imagine someone saying 7 or so. You don't actually mean you understand how, you really understand anything about the phone. You have basic competency in interacting with it. But this is the truth. Almost all the technology that we interact with, right? Or we have only the most superficial understanding of incredibly complicated technologies, which requires a level of interconnectedness and trust of others that is really unprecedented. This occurred to me the other day. I have an electric car and realized I can barely manage the software updates on this thing. Anything goes wrong, I am totally dependent on the company that creates these cars. Okay, so creating complex technologies is possible only through cumulative cultural learning, right? So all of these technologies require, iterating on the ideas of others. And thus, again, the accrual of information makes individuals more capable of adding in kind of novel innovations and inherited insights. So cumulative culture is this process by which all of these different ideas that are distributed in a population are incorporated into existing bodies of knowledge to develop new kinds of technological and social innovations. So I'm interested in our minds and all of the different cognitive capacities and learning strategies that make this possible. I'm equally interested in the institutions and all of the different cultural ways in which we have built transmission systems to store information. And this is a critical part of cumulative culture, right? It's not just having brains that can learn from others. You need to have ways to store and organize and build upon and ratchet up the ideas of previous generations. These storage systems use things like libraries and computers and the internet, institutions that exist exclusively for this purpose, schools, which I talked quite a bit about in this lecture. So I want to start with a quick definition of culture, because there are about 1 million different definitions of culture. As Megan mentioned, I do a lot of comparison, and the comparisons between regions and within cultures, but also with species. So I wanted a definition of culture that works well for all those different types of comparisons. So very generally, I think of culture as just typical behaviors. They're shared by members of the community, and they rely on socially learned and transmitted information. So this is, in defining culture this way makes it seem like this is something that all psychologists study. And psychologists study culture. Although many psychologists, when you ask them if they study culture, they say they do not. But how do you study humans without studying this type of thing? As I mentioned, cultural variability is, I think, our species' most interesting and distinctive features. There's no other animal on the planet that is as adaptable to as many different environments, many coverages. Perhaps not a flattering comparison, but they are tremendously successful. There's no, you can't deny that. But it is our capacity to adapt to complex environments that is the secret to our success. Our minds are cultural learning systems. Human minds exist to learn culture. It's impossible to navigate any sort of human interaction without understanding culture. And they're designed for culture, they're for culture. And the capacity to learn any language, any knowledge, behavior, skill, and human repertoire is made possible by extremely flexible brains, coupled with institutions that exist to transmit information, to store the insights of previous generations. So we know that humans, including young humans, grow up in environments that are full of cultural content. And that includes things like representations, beliefs, rituals, customs, things of that sort, values, emotions, identities. And all of this content is inherited and modified and transmitted across generations. So if you want to think about this culturally evolved suite of cognitive adaptations, one question is, how are humans able to learn this much stuff? So we're a altricial species. Our babies are born pretty incapable of most everything. I'm currently doing society training with my 2.5-year-old, and it's quite astonishing that our species tolerates diaper changing and this kind of thing for the amount of time that we tolerate it. Say no other species would sign up for something like that. So why do we have this very extended juvenile period, right, which is shockingly longer than other species? In fact, when I ask students in my undergraduate classes what the age of adulthood is, what do you know what I say? Age of adulthood. 19, 18, 20, I'm sorry. 13 years. It's probably 35. And I thought it was we have to be looking at how we culture is the explanation for 30-year-olds not considering themselves adults in some cases. So our economies have become so specialized and require so much extended learning, knowledge, and school that this pushes off a lot of the traditional rites of passage necessary to achieve adulthood. So I don't mean to joke or make fun of 30-year-olds. There's a reason, though, that this juvenile period has been pushed farther and farther and further along. Now, our prolonged childhood is useful for lots of reasons. One is it gives us time to learn all of this cultural content. So I'm most interested in how we learn this and also why, right? Neurological maturation is a big part of the story. I'll talk a bit about that. Socialization, experience, learning. Obviously, the whole suite of these things are happening over the course of development. And one of the major issues of studying human psychology or psychological development in just one population is that it can be almost impossible to isolate or decouple any of these different processes, right? So the brain is developing while we're learning and so on and so forth. But I'll explain a little bit more about why it is so challenging to try to understand relative contributions in populations where, for example, all of the children are going to school, their brains are developing at that time, they're all getting particular types of socialization. It's very difficult to understand relative contributions, and thus very easy to attribute development to exclusively to one of these sources, when in fact it's a whole complex system. So I just want to say a little bit about cultural diversity in psychological science, or the lack thereof. So these little blue bits are where the overwhelming majority of research in psychology has been conducted and continues to be conducted. This represents only a very, very tiny portion of the human population. So a couple of years ago, some colleagues of mine and I did really the simplest thing imaginable. Right? We all study cultural diversity, and we all got very tired of talking to our colleagues about how important it was to study global diversity, and not just global diversity, but diversity within populations. There's an enormous amount of diversity within populations that is understudied. What we thought maybe something persuasive would be just to count the populations that have been studied in, at that time, the highest impact developmental journals. Right? So that's all we did. And what we found is that the majority of the studies were conducted in the US. Fortunate English-speaking UK, for example, Australia, European, right? But 90% falls in that category, which I probably don't need to mention. That's not where 90% of the world is, but one thing notable here is that there are twice as many studies of non-human primates in these journals as African children or Asian children. So to say that this is a massive issue is, I just can't overstate that, truly. And there's lots of different ways you can study cultural diversity without doing studies in 30 or 40 different countries. We do some of that, but all of my early research in culture was small-scale comparisons within race. So there's lots of different ways to study culture. And the more we know about different ways to achieve this, I think the more successful we'll be in diversifying our science. So examining the flexibility and diversity of cultural translation and acquisition processes, I'll explain, I think provides insight into this complex process of cumulative learning. Now, the cognitive processes that support this cumulative learning are obviously universal. For example, imitation. Children imitate everywhere. But these processes also have to be responsive to diverse ontogenetic contexts and cultural ontologies. So a big part of what we're studying is how these cognitive processes are adaptable to different contexts. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago about the suite of learning processes that we have, that children have, we all have, to acquire culture. So children, we know they learn through exploring, they learn through participation, they learn through imitation, as I mentioned, they learn through instruction, they observe. All children everywhere this learning, all of these learning strategies. These are clearly universal. So a big part of what I'm trying to understand is, how do we move from documenting variation, which is what a lot of the field has done to the extent that they have studied culture, to explaining it? This requires far more than collecting data across diverse populations with one task, right? To explain variation, you need mixed methods. You need multiple types of tasks, and I'll give you some evidence for this. You need to know about the demographics of your population, child rearing and parenting and schooling. All of that information is required to have any hope of explaining variation. Because otherwise, you collect data one task in 16 different places and find that there's variation. Okay, what do we do with that? The only information I have about those populations is the name of the country and maybe the gender, age of the child. No way to explain that variation. Uganda and the US look different. Yeah, no kidding. Probably do. No way to move from that to where does this variation come from? This is where doing transdisciplinary research is required. Collecting these sorts of data usually requires collaborations with people who have different sorts of expertise, who are familiar with different types of methods. Okay, so I want to show you a little bit about the synergistic ways those learning strategies that I just talked about, observation, participation, how those work together. So the video to the left, this was taken in Tanzania among the Hadza. And I want you to take a look at this and tell me what sorts of learning strategies you think are going on. Grandma, by the way. Clearly some participation, which may or may not be voluntary. When I see videos like this, one of the things that always strikes me is that we do this so much, it doesn't seem unusual. The amount of time and effort we put into including children in activities that actually degrade our efficiency and productivity. we put effort into teaching, right? We put effort even when it doesn't get the job done faster. Maybe it actually really reduces the efficiency, increases the amount of time it takes to get it done. But we do this because we're transmitting information. Right? This is something very distinctive about humans. We are so invested in culture that we are willing to sacrifice in order to transmit it to our children, to the youth, things of that sort. But you've got participation, you've got observation, probably a little bit of imitation. Show you this. This is strongly Republican there. There's me at any group exercise. Literally imitation happening here. Well, we use the whole repertoire, right? The whole repertoire is happening at the same time. And then children are motivated to participate, right? There's no incentivization there, just to be part of the group. So children possess cognitive and communication systems that have evolved to acquire complex technical and social skills. We know children are very attentive to social input, and they learn through observation. You saw a little bit of that. I want to talk a little bit about imitation because of the incredible power imitation has to transmit information, to acquire and transmit it. The imitation is really one of our superpowers, and it's a critical part of social media. Many advantages to imitation. One is that you can learn by watching others and without having to, bother muddling through firsthand experience with things. It's a very efficient way. If I just watch you do something, I don't have to go through the trouble of figuring out how to do it, right? So this is really critical. And young children they're just born to imitate. You have young children, if you've met them, if you've been around them, if you've been one, we do this. And you don't incentivize them. Not only are children highly motivated to imitate, as parents and caregivers and teachers and educators, we are very motivated to encourage this. So case in point. Oops. This is mine. So what it says is, Hope say, da, da. And Hope says, da, da. And his parents in the background explode in applause and delight, right? This one, you might, even if the sound doesn't work, I think you can see. It's a different type of imitation. She's blowing raspberries. So in some ways, it seems trivial. Like, oh, this is a normal thing humans do. No other species on the planet that does this kind of thing, right? So the point is, children are very motivated to do this, and we delight and encourage and incentivize and reward them for doing this. So it's very much a reciprocal system. So a big part of what we've studied is whether this kind of high fidelity copying is an adaptation that really is the foundation for how we acquire culture and are capable of transmission. So we did a simple imitation task, an experimental task involving a simple puzzle box. The task itself is not all that important. But what children saw, children across very, very diverse contexts, national and cultural contexts, they saw an activity being modeled. And then they were given the same materials and told, now it's your turn. They weren't told to imitate, right? They were just given the same material. So I don't know about you, but if I was going to look for a candidate for universality, I think maybe we might have found one here, right? It's kind of what this looks like. And I have to say, these contexts vary in almost all imaginable ways, right? So the industrialization of the economy, the access to schooling, the quality of the schooling, child rape practices. I could go on and on and on. We specifically sampled populations that are enormously variable. I would like to point one embarrassing thing out here. So I kept this up here. We were creating graphs in my lab, and one of my lab managers did not notice that in fact Texas is not a country. I mean, it is in the minds of at least half the state, but we're all myopic in what we notice. But it made me laugh so hard that I refused to change it. So imitation is clearly a big part of acquisition and how we acquire culture, but that's only part of the story, right? We also transmit culture, and we're so invested in this. We don't just do this at home with our own children. We've created formal institutions that exist exclusively to transmit children to our youth, like this one. Right? Some of us like these environments so much, we remember love. So teaching is fascinating for so many different reasons. I think it is the most cognitively sophisticated form of social learning for a couple of different reasons. It allows for very efficient information transfer. There are things that, I think the areas where teaching really excels is skills. For example, it's very, very difficult to learn through firsthand experience and observation. Is this an adaptation that enables cultural transmission? Almost certainly that's the case. I've gotten very fascinated in recent years about how formal education has impacted teaching. Because often the way teaching is studied is the kind of teaching you find in formal education. That is teaching, that counts. Of course, didactic pedagogy, instruction, teaching is so much bigger than that. Like the video, the little, that child in Tanzania, for example, there was teaching happening there without the grandmother saying a word, right? There's many, many, many different ways information can be transmitted through teaching, and formal education prioritizes a narrow subset of what that teaching looks like. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I think the consequences are. So these pictures were taken, this is a father and his daughter in Vanuatu, which is a small scale, small chiefdoms basically in a Melanesian archipelago. And schooling, industrialization, all of those co-occurring institutions have been a relatively recent introduction in this context. And so it is a unique opportunity to really do it for a natural experiment in what introducing schooling does, not just to knowing how to read or write or to math, but also how it transforms everything, including things like parenting. So for this task, what we did is, I don't know if you can tell there's familiar with tangrams, right? So it's just a general figure and these little geometric pieces, and you manipulate them in such a way to create this larger shape. Now, our interest in this task, which was comparative, is not to see if parents in Vanuatu were better at this than parents in the US. Far from it. We selected a task we knew parents everywhere would be successful, right? Because if you want to understand cultural variation in teaching practices, you better pick something that people are equally familiar with or can do well. Otherwise, you're introducing all kinds of other variation there. So we were not interested in can they do it, because we know that they can. We're interested in how they did it. So we videotaped this process. And I think one of the more interesting things we've ever studied. And I will note, this represents a huge portion of the style of research that we do in our center, which is to videotape parent-child, peer, etc., different types of social interactions, and use behavioral coding software to understand what's happening verbally, collaboratively, socially, all of those sorts of things. So I'll show you what we found. Okay, so what you see here are the statements and questions. So we recorded everything they said during this interaction. The blue bar is the US, and the yellow, I guess, beige bar is Vanuatu. So one of the things we found is that overall, there's much, much more speech in the US, and those parent-child dyads from the US. So much so that, frankly, the American parents were just talking constantly, like just constantly. and on all kinds of topics, right? But they're making a lot of statements. Look at all the questions here. None of these questions were necessary to do the task. Parents and children in both of these contexts were perfectly capable of doing this with or without questions, right? So why are parents in the US asking so many questions of their children? Right? Why do we do that? We've been trained to. We assume that we want them to articulate their answers, and we're trying to develop their verbal skills. And we do this because we have been trained to by teachers. So over time, the more school you have, the more you parent like a teacher. And this is very obvious if you work in contexts where you don't have multiple generations of schooling. So studying a population that has been socialized for particular interactional styles for generations and suggesting this is a universal way we teach children is problematic. That's what I mean about the cultural context that we're living in are historically very, very recent. Okay, so speaking of socialized schooling practices, we look for things like the amount of planning speech. Oh, Americans love that. They really do that. They do a lot of planning. So first step is, okay, got the different shapes. Here's our plan. And we use a lot of speech that sounds like it's up to the child. What are we going to do? We use language to suggest that you have what would we like to do today, when in fact I'm like, I actually got an agenda for exactly what's going to happen. But I'm going to use this kind of inclusive language. So they use plenty of the planning, lots of praise. Praise, this shocked me a little bit. This task simply involves picking up little shapes and putting them on another shape. Maybe there's some rotation. This is not exceptionally difficult work. Why so much praise? Oh, you picked the red one. Oh, good job putting that down here. Why do Americans do this? Why the praise over the most mundane of things you can imagine? What would be the function?
We misinterpreted the research on self-esteem.
Amen. You're welcome. Well, that's very true. That's very true. I could not agree more. It is part of our ethno-theory of children's learning, where we have come to the conclusion that children require praise in order to be motivated, right? And I think part of the reason for this is that we do so much direction of their attention. It's like we got to bring the carrots to get them to come along to our, get on our agenda. But it's striking. It's really, really, really striking here. Correction, both do a bit of this, a little bit more in Vanuatu. If you're putting the wrong shape at the wrong place. Notice the probably necessary language here. There's no difference at all. So instruction is really, really similar. The point here is to show how, for the exact same tasks with the exact same
outcome, there's just enormous variation to an extent that was really kind of surprising. And then you get parallels between what the caregivers are doing and what the children are doing. So US caregivers, lots of verbal communication, no surprise, lots of scaffolding through language. Again, questions, planning, praise. Children also produced, I didn't show it in that graph, but children produced much, much, much more language than children in Vanuatu, partly because their parents were asking like 15 questions during the interaction. They also engaged in more behavior. So what I mean by that, I'll explain and use a contrast to illustrate this. In Vanuatu, there's much more use of context, much more touch, much more gesture, scaffolding through correction. But the most common way to approach this task was to divide the activities in child-appropriate ways. So the parents had a bit more experience. The children were included as collaborators, but in a way that supported the greater experience of the caregiver, so that the child's job was to select the particular pieces. Right? So they were given something to do that was absolutely relevant to achieving the goal. What was more common in the US is the parent giving the child illusion of agency and choice and being kind of a backseat driver, where the child was the one doing all the activity. And the parents are saying, wouldn't you like to? How about we do this kind of thing? So there's much more expectation that children do the behavior, probably because they've consumed the developmental psychology literature that children learn through participation. But the style is one of the many reasons I advocate for videotaping. A task, even a simple task like this, whether they achieve the result or not, is by far the least interesting part of these tasks, right? This is a beautiful way to understand variation, where it comes from, what its functionality is. Another thing I want to point out, we found very strong evidence that caregivers that had more formal education, so in a place like Vanuatu, there's variation, right? The caregivers who had been to the most formal schooling used much more language and more direct instruction. So they parent more like teachers. So schools are transmitting and transforming culture, and they're not just introducing literacy and numeracy. They're changing how we're parenting our children, where they're changing what our values are, what our goals are. We need a much more holistic way to understand the effects of speaking and what the implications are for child development more broadly. Schools evolved specifically to reproduce and to replicate cultural representations. So much of the research in comparative education focuses on knowledge, literacy, numeracy, obviously important stuff. But skills, values, and identities and morality, all of those things are being influenced by students. I need so much more information about this. It's also really challenging to study those things, again, in populations where multiple generations of families have been to school, right? It's hard to know where are these things coming from when there's such an omnipotent part of the culture. The best way to study that is to study populations where schooling is relatively more recent, which is one of our strategies. So learning processes, imitation, instruction, etc., observation, they vary in form and frequency. And the variation is associated with all of these things. Beliefs about how children learn, right? Do children need to be praised in order to want to learn, for example? Social organization, knowledge and skills to be acquired, all of these sorts of things. And we need information about all aspects of these in order to understand flexibility in our learning repertoire. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about swinging back to innovation, which is something I'm really interested in for a number of different reasons. So as a species, we rely heavily on technological innovations and solutions. And we're now in these really, really complex rich environments that are full of technological innovation. And so children are in much more artifact and technologically rich environments that they've been in the past. You might think for a species that does so much innovating, young children would be especially good at this. I showed you the graph of imitation. Young children are tremendously good at imitation at early ages. As it turns out, young children are much, much better at using tools than innovating on truths. there's really very little evidence of precocious innovation. So it's kind of interesting to juxtapose imitation and innovation, both cognitively very, very sophisticated, but we are much better, at least kind of out the gate, at one of these than the other. Why is innovation maybe slower to develop? It's very complicated. We published a paper in TICS about the many different cognitive processes that are required for innovation. You've got to recognize the problem. You have to generate solutions, transmit it to others. This is just a subset of the different cognitive capacities that are required, right? It makes sense that this would be a little slower to develop. This is an example of how innovation has been studied. I would say this is probably doesn't actually meet all the criteria of innovation. I would call it more like creative problem solving, but that is a big part of innovation. Anyone familiar with the task? There's a little tiny basket, like a dollhouse basket in there. You're given either a pipe cleaner or a string, and you have to come up with the solutions and get that little basket out, which involves a hook. The string is not going to be a good candidate for that. You hook it and you pull it right out. So remember what that imitation graph looked like. It did not look like this. So children everywhere start out really bad at solving this task, but we get much better, much faster. And there's very strong schooling effects for performance on this task, which schooling effects from my perspective are just evidence of socialization and social, particular type of cultural input. You might be curious about whether performance on imitation and innovation are related. They're not at all, right? So we know a big part of cultural learning involves imitation, it involves innovation, but these things are not related. Performance on these are not related. Couple of things about other cognitive capacities that support this. Cognitive flexibility and some self-regulation. So I mentioned before that using multiple tasks is really critical for understanding any cognitive capacity. Cognitive flexibility, adaptation of representations and responses to meeting task demands. This improves really dramatically in early childhood. So if you're familiar with the DCCS, which is just a rule switching task, if you look at graphs of this, it looks like linear improvement from 3 to 5. This has been done a number of times. This is a sort of a play up the DCCS. So you have cards that vary in multiple dimensions, and then you can sort the same cards by multiple dimensions. So blue or dawn or size, etc. This task is matched for difficulty, except instead of arbitrary rules or abstract rules like color, shape, whatever, use linguistic cues. So this is a set, novel word, right? This lives in a safe environment. Okay. So when you do these tasks in Austin, Texas, children's performance is incredibly similar across these tasks because beautiful linear improvement. And you might come to believe that these tasks measure exactly the same thing, right? They're similar, right? Same measure. Okay. So we did a comparative study in the US and South Africa. We selected those populations to examine schooling effects. South African preschool age children weren't in school. US children were in school. That linguistics cue task, right? This looks universal, right? Developmental improvement there. No difference between these populations, despite massive difference in schooling experience. Here is that DCCS abstract rule. In the US, you get the same developmental improvement that you see everywhere, right? Not everywhere that's been typically studied. In South Africa, you don't see the same improvement, right? So just imagine how incorrect our conclusions would have been if we could use only one of these tasks, the comparative trial, right? What did children learn to preschool? What did they do? We're going to spend all our time doing, other than pulling each other's hair. Sorting by abstract. Exactly. So that's what I mean. If you read the literature on this and they talk about improvements in cognitive flexibility, it's all about neurological maturation. And the brain gets developing around that age. But they're also going to school. It's so easy to misattribute development to one source when in fact your environments are full of conflicts. Okay. Self-regulation, my favorite thing. The ability to direct behavior and control your impulses to achieve goals. We have to do this to achieve anything in the world. This is strongly associated with academic achievement. Why it's so interesting. This beautiful task of behavioral self-regulation. I'm a huge fan. Way before I met a decade before, in fact. So I want to show you some comparative data that we collected with this task. Many reasons I love this task. The motoric element of it, it's beautiful in lots of ways, and it works everywhere. Children everywhere can learn this task really, really well. So this is what the data look like if you plot everything from Australia, Colombia, Republic of Congo, Vanuatu. We're finding age-related changes in performance on this particular task. Here's what this looks like if you break this down by country, right? So imagine if we're just studying this in Australia. What are our conclusions about the development of self-regulation based on those data? They basically come to school almost at the yeah, okay. You ask, why you'll notice, I don't know if you'll notice this, why you point this out. These are basically ordered by school access and quality. Okay? So populations we've studied in these countries, schools are very recently introduced, school quality is low, formal school quality, I mean. So all of these, schooling is incredibly consequential for behavioral self-regulation measured in this particular. Yeah. But imagine how problematic it would be to make universal conclusions using any one of those different data points. Okay. Here's academic achievement, same populations. So looking kind of similar there. These are composite scores of literacy and numeracy, right? Looks a whole lot like the HTKS. I promise you, they're not the same data. It's a totally different task. Very strong relationships between self-regulation and math. Everywhere, the relationships are stronger in environments where schooling is better and there's better access. Same with reading, not as robust in the relationship as math. The relationship to math is leading the way, especially in some of the populations we're studying. So, to wrap up, schools are playing this incredibly formative role in organizing children's learning interests and milestones that are required for maturity. They're transforming the world in ways we've just begun to understand, and decoupling maturation from educational experience requires research in populations where you don't have multi-generation schooling. Now, there's brilliant, incredibly brilliant experimental science cutoff, for example. Chief Fred Morrison was one of the pioneers of this. There are ways to look at schooling effects in populations with high levels of schooling, but it's more complicated. And we should be studying schools in holistic ways and think about them as agents of cultural transformation, not just places that kids go to learn to read and write. So the cultural, linguistic, educational technologies, institutions, and populations are shaping the development of minds. Our collective intelligence is responsible or is made possible because we have these institutions that store and transmit information. And again, the flexibility and sociality of human psychology, I think, provides unique insight into the identity evaluation system of care, which I think is essential to understand cultural complexity. Years the research.
A few minutes for some questions. And so I'm happy. Oh, is there something?
Yeah. Real quick, before anybody heads out, we have some sign-in sheets if folks wouldn't mind filling these out before.
Yeah, so we know who's coming. Okay, and I didn't pay Cristine to put all that nice stuff up because I had our measure. I had no idea. That's great. That's awesome.
Oh,
no?
Actually.
I know. Okay. Questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Cultures develop to enable a population to survive and thrive in their environment. And the culture depends very strongly on the environment. You can have a very different culture in a rainforest than in a desert and all that. Absolutely. And the problem is culture tends to be self-propagating. It tries to keep itself going. Yeah, and when the environment changes, that can lead to major problems. Now, sometimes the environment changes because of new technology or climate change. Most often it changes because of migration. The people move someplace else. Has anybody been looking into how you adapt to changing environment when you have a culture that's trying to propagate itself?
So this is, I would say this is a topic that I think about more than any other. And I think about it in the context of schooling and the tension between cultural stasis and cultural change, where you need to have both. Now, schools were designed to serve particular functions, and that is to transmit particular types of information with high fidelity. We have propagated this all over the world, right? And schools are absolutely, like many institutions, are resistant to change. So we've known for more than 100, 200 years, all the different ways in which we need to change schools, right? You read John Dewey, you're like, yep, we're still there. Right? It's widely known what needs to be different. We have made almost no fundamental changes to these institutions. Not because we don't know, we don't have the answers. We have answers about what would be helpful. We don't have answers about how to change schools. But to our credit, schools are exceptionally difficult to change structurally, right? One of the reasons schooling has been so successful is that it is resistant to change, similar to organized religion and other very successful institutions. So there's I think, a deep inconsistency in what we need schools to do now and what schools were designed to do, right? Schools are still good at what they were designed to do, which is to transmit literacy and numeracy and high fidelity over large populations. Are schools responsive to the demands of the current economy and teaching creative thinking and STEM process skills? They were designed for that, right? And they're resistant to that. So there's a huge tension, I think, in our ability to rapidly and flexibly change things we rely institutions to transmit. So, and that's why a lot of the innovation in our economies now aren't happening in institutions.
Questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, it's very instructive for me because I'm also in the culture. And I noticed in the presentation there are lots of culture difference among countries. Yeah. So my question is like, when you focus on some culture difference in one country, I mean, the sample group, sure, culture difference.
Yeah.
How how will you define or to evaluate that one?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of one of the ways to study within country variation, of which there's in many cases more variation within a population than between populations, right? And we can talk later about advantages of far versus close comparison. So comparing the US to Vanuatu would be about as far as you can get. We did that for a reason, because we're interested in how schooling is transforming parent socialization. We need to work in populations that don't have formal schooling. But in most cases, to actually pull apart the different sources of variation, you really do need to work within a population, right? The US and Vanuatu, they differ in so many ways. There's no way we can isolate only, one of those. It's just not possible, right? So we did a study a couple of years ago where we were interested in how people think about conformity, how adults think about conformity. And what we did is we showed adults videos of young children engaging in high conformity behavior, so imitating very precisely, and low conformity behavior, like doing some of the tasks, but really not imitating carefully. And they'd see both those videos, and we'd ask parents, which of these children do you think is smart? And because we're doing it in the US, the immediate response from parents is like, oh, couldn't possibly choose. Like all children are smart. Actually, memory. So what we found is that parents, were more likely to select the low conforming child as the smartest, right? Now keep in mind, so this child is just not imitated something carefully, right? And these American parents are saying things like, oh, future leader, an innovator, look at how creative, right? It's like, wow, that's a lot to build into a child not imitating something very carefully. But we expanded upon this to look at variation in SES. So we recruited in a sample of adults that varied enormously in how much education they had, their income, things of that sort. And what we found very, very quickly is that high education, that was the biggest predictor, not income. High education parents were much more likely to associate low conformity with intelligence than parents with less education, right? Which is much more the global norm, right? We did this in Vanuatu, in fact. And we showed them high conformity, low conformity children. We didn't label that. All they saw was children doing tasks. And the parents in Vanuatu almost always picked the high conformity child and would say, what an excellent brain this child has, or mind, we use the word brain. What an excellent mind. They clearly understand the task demands. They're a quick learner. Right? They're not saying anything about, oh, they're obedient or anything like that, right? So by studying within and between population variation, you start to get a glimpse of where some of these sources of variation come from. Right? And in American schools, high SES families, we are in immensely competitive educational environments where we are looking for our children to stand out and to do something different and to get notice. We pay companies to distinguish our child's college application from other children, right? So we fetishize this sort of, rake from the herd type of behavior. Is that actually a sign of intelligence? I'm immensely doubtful. I just do think it's pretty fascinating how little information we actually need to make these kinds of assessments. So there's just as much within population variation, and that's based on SES, as between population variation. Our working class sample in the US looked identical to our small scale horticulturalist population in the middle of the South. So it's critical to do population comparison. And you should do this based on the research interest that you mark.
Right. To build off of that, like non-conforming mind, I was thinking you said like socially learned and transmitted info. And I was thinking, how does that work for a neurodivergent person who maybe has autism or some other kind of processing, their brain is just processing information differently. And a lot of the information that we learn is subtle cues. And if you don't have the ability to pick up on those, how do you fare, I guess, in the group?
Right. Well, if you are in, formal schooling environments where they teach in your group really not to the individual, you're probably going to have a lot of struggle there. That the lack of individualized attention and instruction, kind of tailoring to the individual, is not something that institutions excel at. You all might have noticed that. So in fact, in environments where apprenticeship is much more common and you're learning one-on-one with an expert, your teacher in that context is much, more capable of providing that kind of individualized instruction. So I'm glad you brought that up because I that's relevant for things like neurodivergence, but I think more generally, thinking about match and mismatch is very, very powerful, right? Why is performance on self-regulation tasks such a powerful predictor of academic achievement, right? That partly has to do with individual institutional match. To excel in school, you need to sit just like you all have done for an hour and look at me and attend to me and inhibit distractions and not look on Etsy or whatever. Don't look at the news. Fear scrolling. But you have to be able, regulate your attention in order to basically attend to externally managed stimuli over the long run. So if those are things you struggle with, there's a lot of content you miss. When you think about the cumulative effects of this over time, you probably are going to learn less of a particular type of content. So schools weren't designed for individuals. They simply weren't. It's about a sort of mass transmission. And as I say, schools are still, generally speaking, good at that. Are they good at the kind of individual customization? No. And people, when I mention that, oh, but we've got these innovative scoring systems, Montessori, scales, not even remotely. And it's not scalable based on our current constraints. So there isn't actually a competitor to the institution of formal schooling that exists everywhere in the world, right? We haven't made change because this institution was designed to resist change on many, many, many different levels. So as educational psychologists, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. This is proven to be very difficult. We have our work cut out for us.
I appreciate you saying that. I work with a lot of different schools, actually all over the state. What would be one thing that you would change? What would be one straightforward action that you would say would improve the educational circumstances here in the United States?
So I think I would start with what our end goal is, right? What are the competencies, the skills, the toolkits, the knowledge that we need our future citizens, current citizens, children, also citizens, that we need our young people to learn. Start with that instead of here's an antiquated curriculum that we have been making only the most incremental modifications on for many, many, many decades at this point. I don't need to export this to every corner of the world. Rather than start with this educational ritual that we subject children to for many, many years, you're also indoctrinated in this. Then look at this. We don't even have to give you any instruction. I know where to stand. You know where to stand. It works. There's a kind of behavioral fluency associated with this. The problem, though, is, again, it wasn't set up to learn the types of skills that we currently need children to learn. It's so much larger. We're not struggling really on that front, not to the same extent. Does it get to the, cater to all of the needs of all of the students? But starting with what do we need schools to do now and moving kind of back from there, because we're currently going the opposite direction. And we've tried all the incremental tweaks and it hasn't moved. And the consequence of this is that we have immensely wealthy individuals who publicly proclaim that they're college dropouts and that they learn nothing useful in school. And that if I can do this, you can do this too. The lack of relevancy, the risk of that is worrying. I do believe we do need schools. I think schools are one of the greatest, innovations of humanity. Just, I think, limp it along with an institution that needs, a full structural overhaul.
I'm curious your comment on schools haven't had a competitor, so they haven't changed. And thought about this in the higher education context, but I'm going to ask you about it in a primary context as well. I think generative AI is our competitor.
Yes.
And it's the competition's on the doorstep. And I'd be nice to my class the other day, not all of college used to be you come to class because I was the only one with the book. Y'all can get it however you want now.
Right.
So I'm just curious your thoughts on culture, technology, and it's essentially, is there a catastrophic change in virtually?
Illustration of my point about schools being resistant to change and conservative, I don't mean politically necessarily, but Chat GPT comes out. What do schools do?
Off the phone.
Blah, blah, or bid. Really? innovation is happening in the tech sector, and many problems with that, right? The lack of regulation, the lack of any kind of oversight, the fact that most teachers aren't educated in how to scaffold and prepare children to interact with these technologies, where we have tech industries policing, regulating themselves. That's a good idea. Allow companies to regulate themselves. The government doesn't understand the technologies well enough to do an effective job. So innovation is happening in an entirely unregulated space and outside of institutions that are publicly controlled. That's where we are. And that was going to happen. I mean, it seemed like it came out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nowhere. This has been this is down the horizon for quite some time. But it's very predictable that schools would respond in that way, right? Which is just again, this is moving farther and farther away from convincing students that this is relevant, legitimate, and necessary.
I think we're over time, but so I don't want to keep you and you have other things, but really stimulating conversation and questions and wonderful talk. And just want to say thanks a lot, Cristine, for coming.